Hi, my name is Jennifer, and I live in Manhattan. And normally I would be out on the city streets marching with the protesters around the city to support Black Lives Matter, demanding justice for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and the list just never ends. But like so many others in this strange, unpredictable reality of COVID-19, I'm concerned about the health of my 3-year-old daughter. I've marched alongside Black Lives Matter any chance I've had since the death of Trayvon Martin. So this situation really has made me feel very conflicted and frustrated. So I started to wonder what else I could do to stand in solidarity at this pivotal moment in history. I believe Black voices and leadership should be in the spotlight, and that what white people should be doing right about now is taking time to educate ourselves about racism's history and current manifestations and reflect on toxic white culture. So I thought that in these unprecedented times, the most helpful thing that I might be able to do would be to start a very hard conversation that always gets shut down because it's an embarrassing conversation for white people that takes humility, courage, and strength to engage. White people being honest about systematic racism in America, the part each and every one of us plays in it, and the sacrifices we specifically as white people need to make to change it. White denial, defensiveness, and lack of knowledge is obviously a major roadblock to progress that requires more than just marching or even much needed legislation. There has to be a fundamental shift in how white people, one, truly process, understand, and acknowledge racism, two, how we talk about racism in public and private settings, and three, how we personally approach ending racism. And here in this space, I want to honestly focus on those aspects of the issue. So let's first admit that the vast majority of white conversations about racism start and end with, well, I'm not racist. Like that takes care of that. It does not. Below that baseline, there are multiple levels and layers of racism that run the wide spectrum from overt hatefulness and inciting violence to claiming belief in equality while actually guarding the status quo, all while passing racism directly, if not always totally obviously, to new generations. But I have hope that we're approaching a tipping point and awareness and support of the movement for Black lives. It took, unfortunately, as many of us expected, hitting absolute rock bottom with an administration that willfully unleashed the most destructive manifestations of the most unevolved and unconscious version of the human condition. Yet today we see corporations and influential organizations finally coming out for Black Lives Matter like never before, because they finally were forced to choose to emerge above the baseline. And that's because Black and brown people have tirelessly given their blood, sweat, tears, and very lives to get us to this point. Confederate statues and flags are coming down. Being from the South, that makes me so happy. American heroes like Colin Kaepernick and so many others are receiving apologies and praise. And major brands are posting their commitments to the movement on their websites. But what are white people really doing internally? Have we taken responsibility, tried hard enough to educate and evolve white American culture? We must go further beyond being allies to the movement or calling ourselves supporters of the Black and brown people who sacrifice everything to try to wake us up and make life livable for their children and families. Hashtags can help, but social media activism, while a fine start, isn't enough. Fighting back and forth with obstinate racists who don't believe they're racist on Facebook is definitely not going to work and isn't a good use of energy or time. Shaming people who don't get on board usually makes them dig their heels in even further. So I thought deeply about how this could work, and I thought we could try modeling conversations among white people who are courageous and mature enough to put ego aside and be transparent about our own fraught journeys from ignorance to awareness to action, and beyond allies to owners, ready to do what it takes. So in addition to protests, our votes and major policy changes, what does it take? How do we change hearts and minds? We're currently experiencing a tremendous surge in human evolution and the spiritual transition from a limited three-dimensional material world to a more expansive perception and vision of who and what we are and can become. It's the perfect moment for white people to openly reflect upon, discuss, and learn from our experiences being raised as American racists. Because every single one of us was, whether we want to believe it or not. By the very nature of our socialization in this white patriarchal pseudo-Christian nationalist culture, if we truly want to stop racism, then there's no room for continuing to deny it or defend ourselves. Let's just be honest. As things have recently escalated physically and energetically, I realize that baseline and above mentality white people tend to proudly declare ourselves allies while still expecting Black and brown people to carry the burden and fix the problem that our people created. It's time to stop praying for change or posting for change and make change by being the first to change. It's time for white people to stand up and take responsibility for what we have forced Black and brown people to endure, or so often not even survive, and do the hard internal work to actually create a new and different society from the inside out. White fragility, added to the ever-present universal human ego, makes us terrified of being called racists. What does it look like to release the addiction to power and privilege in order to heal ourselves? Imagine the transformation offered by transparent discussions among white people about the failures of white culture in front of and in deference to Black and brown people's realities and experiences. What if we had discussions willing to expose the social pressure to stay quiet, the lies, misrepresentations, the skewed white perspectives taught in our schools and textbooks, religious institutions, Sunday school classrooms, communities, and families? The subtle messages in advertising, television, film, art, and music, especially from the past. The fear and loathing placed in our hearts to keep us mindlessly perpetuating racism. No one's born a racist. Racists are very carefully and quietly made, but we cannot be quiet about it any longer. I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and when I moved to Manhattan in 2004, I was humiliated by the questions people would ask me about my hometown and its terrible history. Some people asked me outright if I was racist, and I would cry, "Of course not." But back then, I really had no idea what racism was. The worst part was I didn't know a lot of the most sordid details of the sins of my origins. People who had been raised and educated to understand the civil rights movement had to teach me things that shocked me. I had believed a revisionist history carefully taught by my community that downplayed and defended major historical atrocities and made heroes of fragile white people who only cared about their own corrupt and cowardly lives. I was horrified to face the fact that I had looked around at the world growing up and believed everything was fair and equal when it came to race, and that those who spoke up were making it up, much like I had been tricked into believing about gender. I went along my way taking undue white privilege for granted. I was complicit in my silence about what I was conscious enough to be curious about, and I really and truly believed I didn't have a racist bone in my body. I was afraid to question my white fundamentalist evangelical God because he might stop protecting me. It wasn't easy to learn that my own mind and body had been infected from inception by that white patriarchal God who put people in God's white image to sleep and inserted Adam's rotten racist rib. It took being confronted by people and stories and truths that scared me and challenged everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. I had to deconstruct everything. I had to sever ties with the institutions and people who had raised me and benefited me in many ways. But it's a reckoning I call on every white American to have right now so that we can be brave, make things right, reimagine the world, and create a new society that we're destined to bring to Earth. There will always be white people who refuse to be honest. Since I know racism to be an ancestral issue that is passed down in our very DNA and sickens every cell of our bodies, hearts, and minds, I believe every white person who has the strength and integrity to be honest must stand in the gap and close the gap by atoning for our forefathers who built this country on the backs of Black and brown people. We must do the work on behalf of our relatives, both living and dead. It's our duty and our purpose as humanity awakens. There's a long overdue evolutionary rush of elevated capacity for consciousness sweeping our planet right now. We have to harness that energy in all the diverse ways that we have each been given talents, capabilities, and desires to add to the movement. So here we are, a space for white people to begin, or to grow, or to help others learn to identify systemic racism and our part in it, to make the problem plain and take it on. Not to feed any white savior fantasies, not one more white guy on Twitter bragging about being arrested at a protest as if they are single-handedly saving Black people. But what I'm talking about is white people willing to do the painful, personal, and cultural purging that awaits those of us making our way to a new world. So what will follow is video conversations among white people, scholars, theologians, activists, artists, moms and dads, teachers, to interrogate toxic white American life. We'll tell stories of how we have failed, how we have reckoned with ourselves, and how we embarked on the humble journey to awareness, understanding, and action. The goal is to model an honest process of self-reflection and try to normalize a new kind of socialization. I believe in telling our stories to learn from them and heal from them, and then to realize that we're not our stories, but we're called to transcend them, to heal and evolve our DNA and eradicate racism now and for all generations to come. Please join us.